Sorry, everybody, I'm going a little late, but let's get started here. Alright, so we had left it with the call for land ho had just been made, and they are about to make landfall. Yes, the last line was, and almost at the same time, the voice of the lookout shouted, "Land ho!" Chapter 12. Council of War. There was a great rush of feet across the deck. I could hear people tumbling up from the cabin and the forecastle, and slipping in an instant outside the barrel, I dived behind the foresail, made a double towards the stern, and came out on the open deck in time to join Hunter and Dr. Livesey in the rush for the weather bow. For the weather bow. There, all hands were already congregated. A belt of fog had lifted almost simultaneously with the appearance of the moon. Away to the southwest of us, we saw two low hills, about a couple of miles apart, and, rising behind one of them, a third and higher hill whose peak was still buried in the fog. All three seemed sharp and conical in figure. So much I saw, almost in a dream, for I had not yet recovered from my horrid fear of a minute or two before. And then I heard the voice of Captain Smollett issuing orders. In his manual was laid a couple of points near the wind, and now sail the course that would just clear the island on the east. "And now, men," said the captain, when all was sheeted home, "has any one of you ever seen that land ahead?" "I have, sir," said Silver. "I've watered there with a trader I was cooking." "The anchorage is on the south, behind an inlet, I fancy?" asked the captain. "Yes, sir. Skeleton Island, they calls it. It were a main place for pirates once, and a hand we had on board knowed all the names for it. That hill on the north'ard they calls the foremast hill. There are 3 hills in a row running south'ards, fore, main, and mizzen, sir. But the main, that's the big un, with the cloud on it, that usually calls the spyglass, by reason of a lookout they kept when they was in the anchorage clearing. For it's there they cleared their ships, sir, asking your pardon." "I have a chart here," says Captain Smollett. "See if that's the place." Long John's eyes burned in his head as he took the chart, but by the fresh look at the paper, I knew he was doomed to disappointment. This was not the map we found in Billy Bones's chest, but an accurate copy, complete in all things, names and heights and soundings, with the single exception of the red crosses and the written notes. Sharp as must have been his annoyance, Silver had the strength of mind to hide it. "Yes, sir," says he. "This is the spot to be sure, and very prettily drawn out. Who might have done that, I wonder? The pirates were all too ignorant, I reckon. Ah, here it is, Captain Kidd's anchorage, just the name my shipmate call it. There's a strong current runs along the south, and then away northward up the west coast. Right you was, sir," says he, "to haul your wind and keep the weather of the island. Leastways, that such was your intention as to why they enter and careen, and there ain't no better place for that in these waters." "Thank you, my man," says Captain Smollett. "I'll ask you, later on, to give us a help. You may go." I was surprised at the coolness with which John avowed his knowledge of the island, and I was half frightened when I saw him drawing nearer to myself. He did not know, to be sure, that I had overheard his counsel from the apple barrel, and yet I had, by this time, taken such a horror of his cruelty, duplicity, and power, that I could scarce conceal a shudder when he laid his hand upon my arm. "Ah," says he, "this here is a sweet spot, this island. A sweet spot for a lad to get ashore on. You'll bathe, and you'll climb trees, and you'll hunt goats, you will. And you'll get aloft on them hills, like a goat yourself. Why, makes me young again. I was going to forget me timber leg, I was. It's a pleasant thing to be young, and have 10 toes, and you may lay it to that. When you want to go a bit of exploring, you just ask old John, and he'll put up a snack for you to take along. And clapping me in the friendliest manner upon the shoulder, he hobbled off forward and went below. Captain Smollett, the squire, and Dr. Livesey were talking together on the quarter-deck, and anxious as I was to tell them my story, I durst not interrupt them openly. While I was still casting about in my thoughts to find some probable excuse, Dr. Livesey called me to his side. He had left his pipe below, and, being a slave to tobacco, had meant that I should fetch it. But as soon as I was near enough to speak, and not to be overheard, I broke out immediately. "Doctor, let me speak. Get the captain and squire down to the cabin, and then make some pretense to send for me. I have terrible news." The doctor changed countenance a bit, but next moment he was master of himself. "Thank you, Jim," he said, quite loudly. "That was all I wanted to know," as if he had asked me a question. And with that he turned on his heel and rejoined the other two. They spoke together for a little, and though none of them started or raised his voice, or so much as whistled, it was plain enough that Dr. Livesey had communicated my request. For the next thing that I heard was the captain giving an order to Job Anderson, and all hands were piped on deck. "My lads," said Captain Smollett, "I have a word to say to you. This land that we have sighted is the place we have been sailing to. Mr. Trelawney, being a very open-handed gentleman, as we all know, has just asked me a word or two, and as I was able to tell him that every man on board had done his duty, alow and aloft, as I never asked to see it done better, why, he and I and the doctor are going below to the cabin to drink your health and luck, and you'll have grog served out to you to drink our health and luck. I'll tell you what I think of this. I think it's handsome. And, if you think as I do, you'll give a good sea cheer for the gentleman that does it." The cheer followed. That was a matter of course, but it rang out so full and hearty that I confess I could hardly believe these same men were plotting for our blood. "One more cheer for Captain Smollett!" cried Long John, when the first had subsided, and this was also given with a will. On the top of that, the 3 gentlemen went below, and not long after, word was sent forward that Jim Hawkins was wanted in the cabin. I found them all 3 seated round the table, a bottle of Spanish wine and some raisins before them, and the doctor smoking away with his wig on his lap, and that, I knew, was a sign that he was agitated. The stern window was open, for it was a warm night, and you could see the moon shining behind on the ship's wake. "Now, Hawkins," said the squire, "you have something to say? Speak up." I did as I was bid, and, as short as I could make it, told the whole details of Silver's conversation. Nobody interrupted me till I was done, nor did any one of the 3 of them make so much as a movement, but they kept their eyes upon my face from first to last. "Jim," said Dr. Livesey, "take a seat," as they made me sit at the table beside them, poured me out a glass of wine, filled my hands with raisins, and all 3, one after the other, and each, with a bow, drank my good health, and their service to me, for my luck and courage. "Now, Captain," said the squire, "you were right, and I was wrong, and I own myself an ass, and I await your orders." "No more of an ass than I, sir," returned the captain. "I never heard of a crew that meant to mutiny but what showed signs before, for any man that had an eye in his head to see that mischief and take steps according, but this crew," he added, "beats me." "Captain," said the doctor, "with your permission, that's Silver, a very remarkable man." "He'd look remarkably well for a yard-arm, sir," returned the captain, "but this is talk that just don't lead to anything. I see 3 or 4 points, and with Mr. Trelawney's permission I'll name them." "You, sir, are the captain. It is for you to speak," says Mr. Trelawney grandly. "First point," began Mr. Smollett. "We must go on, because we can't turn back. If I gave the word to go about, they would rise at once. And second point, we have time before us, at least until this treasure is found. Third point, there are faithful hands. Now, sir, it's got to come to blows sooner or later, and what I propose is to take time by the forelock, as the saying is, and come to blows some fine day when they least expect it. We can count, I take it, on your own home servants, Mr. Trelawney?" "As upon myself," declared the squire. "3, reckon the captain. Ourselves make 7, counting Hawkins here. Now, about the honest hands." "Most likely Trelawney's own men," said the doctor, "those he had picked up for himself before he lit on silver." "Nay," replied the squire, "Hans was one of mine." "I didn't think I could have trusted Hans," added the captain. "And to think they're all Englishmen," broke out the squire. "Sir, I could find it in my heart to blow the ship up." "Well, gentlemen," said the captain, "the best that I can say is not much. We must lay to, if you please, and keep a bright lookout. It's very trying on a man, I know. It would be pleasanter to come to blows, but there's no help for it until we know our men. Lay to and whistle for a wind. That's my view." "Jim here," said the doctor, "can help us more than anyone. The men are not shy with him, and Jim is a noticing lad. Hawkins, I put prodigious faith in you," added the squire. I began to feel pretty desperate at this, for I felt altogether helpless. And yet, by an odd train of circumstances, it was indeed through me that safety came. In the meantime, talk as we pleased, there were only 7 out of the 26 of whom we knew we could rely, and out of those 7, 1 was a boy, so that the grown men on our side were 6 to their 19. Part 3. My Shore Adventure. And Chapter 13. How I Began My Shore Adventure. The appearance of the island, when I came on deck next morning, was altogether changed. Although the breeze had now utterly failed, we had made a great deal of way during the night, and were now lying becalmed about half a mile to the southeast of the low eastern coast. Grey-colored woods covered a large part of the surface. This even tint was indeed broken up by streaks of yellow sandbrake in the lower lands, and by many tall trees of the pine family out-topping the others, some singly, some in clumps. But the general coloring was uniform and sad. The hills ran up clear above the vegetation in spires of naked rock. All were strangely shaped, and the spyglass, which was by 300 or 400 feet the tallest on the island, was likewise the strangest in configuration, running up sheer from almost every side, and then suddenly cut off at the top, like a pedestal to put a statue on. The Hispaniola was rolling scuppers under in the ocean swell, and the booms were tearing at the blocks. The rudder was banging to and fro, and the whole ship creaking, groaning, and jumping like a manufactory. Manufactory, huh? I'll have to look that word up, I'm not sure. I had to cling tight to the backstay, and the world turned giddily before my eyes, for though I was a good enough sailor when there was a way on, this standing still and being rolled about like a bottle was a thing I never learned to stand without a qualm or so. Above all in the morning, or an empty stomach. Perhaps it was this. Perhaps it was the look of the island, with its grey, melancholy woods and wild stone spires, and the surf that we could both see and hear foaming and thundering on the steep beach, at least, although the sun shone bright and hot, and the shore birds were fishing and crying all about us, that you could have thought anybody would have been glad to get to land after being so long at sea. My heart sank, as the saying is, into my boots. From that first look onward, I hated the very thought of Treasure Island. We had a dreary morning's work before us, for there was no sign of any wind, and the boats had to be got out and manned, and the ship warped 3 or 4 miles around the corner of the island, and up the narrow passage to the haven behind Skeleton Island. I volunteered for one of the boats, where I had, of course, no business. The heat was sweltering, and the men grumbled fiercely over their work. Edson was in command of my boat, and instead of keeping the crew in order, he grumbled as loud as the worst. "Well," he said with an oath, "it's not forever." I thought this was a very bad sign, for up to that day the men had gone briskly and willingly about their business, but the very sight of the island had relaxed the cords of discipline. All the way in, Long John stood by the steersman and conned to the ship. He knew the passage like the palm of his hand, and though the man in the chains got everywhere more water than was down in the chart, John never hesitated once. "There's a strong scour with the ebb," he said, "and this here passage has been dug out, in a manner of speaking, with a spade." We brought up just where the anchor was in the chart, about a third of a mile from either shore, the mainland on one side and Skeleton Island on the other. The bottom was clean sand. The plunge of our anchor set up clouds of birds wheeling and crying over the woods, but in less than a minute they were down again, and all was once more silent. The place was entirely landlocked, buried in woods, the trees coming right down to high water mark, the shores mostly flat, and the hilltops standing around at a distance, in a sort of amphitheater, one here, one there, two little rivers, or rather 2 swamps, emptied out into this pond, as you might call it, and the foliage around that part of the shore had a kind of poisonous brightness. From the ship we could see nothing of the house or stockade, for they were quite buried amongst trees. And if it had not been for the chart or the companion, we might have been the first that had ever anchored there since the island arose from the sea. There was not a breath of air moving, nor a sound but that of the surf booming half a mile away along the beaches and against the rocks outside. A peculiar stagnant smell hung over the anchorage, a smell of sodden leaves and rotting tree trunks. I observed the doctor sniffing and sniffing like someone tasting a bad egg. "I don't know about treasure," he said, "but I'll stake my wig there's fever here." If the conduct of the men had been alarming in the boat, it became truly threatening when they had come aboard. They lay about the deck, growling together in talk. The slightest order was received with a black look and grudgingly and carelessly obeyed. Even the honest hands must have caught the infection, for there was not one man aboard to mend another. Mutiny, it was plain, hung over us like a thundercloud. And it was not only we of the cabin party who perceived the danger. Long John was hard at work, going from group to group, spending himself in good advice, and, as for example, no man could have shown a better. He fairly outstripped himself in willingness and civility. He was all smiles to everyone. If an order were given, John would be on his crutch in an instant, with the cheeriest "Aye, aye, sir," in the world. And when there was nothing else to do, he kept up one song after another, as if to conceal the discontent of the rest. Of all the gloomy features on that gloomy afternoon, this obvious anxiety on the part of Long John appeared the worst. We held a council in the cabin. "Sir," said the captain, "if I risk another order, the whole ship'll come about our ears by the run. You see, sir, here it is. I get a rough answer, do I not? Well, if I speak back, Pikes will be going in 2 shakes, and if I don't, Silver will see there's something under that, and the game's up. Now we're only one man to rely on." "And who is that?" asked the squire. "Silver, sir," returned the captain. "He's as anxious as you and I to smother things up. This is a tiff. He'd soon talk him out of it, if he had the chance. And what I propose to do is to give him the chance. Let's allow the men an afternoon ashore. If they all go, why, we'll fight the ship. If they none of them go, well, then, we hold the cabin, and God defend the right. If some go, you mark my word, sir, Silver will bring 'em aboard again, as mild as lambs." It was so decided. Loaded pistols were served out to all the shoremen. Hunter, Joyce, and Redruth were taken into our confidence, and received the news with less surprise and a better spirit than we had looked for. And then the captain went on deck and addressed the crew. "My lads," said he, "we have had a hot day, and are all tired and out of sorts. A turn ashore will hurt nobody. The boats are still in the water. You can take the gigs. Take the jigs, and as many as please can go ashore with the afternoon. I'll fire a gun half an hour before sundown. I believe the silly fellows must have thought that they would break their shins over treasure as soon as they had landed, for they all came out of their sulks in a moment and gave a cheer that started the echo in a faraway hill and sent the birds once more flying and squalling around the anchorage. The captain was too bright to be in the way. He whipped out of sight in a moment, leaving Silver to arrange the party, and I fancy it was well that he did so. Had he been on deck, he could no longer so much as have pretended not to understand the situation. It was as plain as day. Silver was the captain, and a mighty rebellious crew he had of it. The honest hands, and I was soon to see it proved that there were such on board, must have been very stupid fellows. Or rather, I suppose the truth was this, that all hands were disaffected by the example of the ringleaders, only some more, some less, and a few, being good fellows in the main, could neither be led nor driven any farther. It is one thing to be idle and skulk, and quite another to take a ship and murder a number of innocent men. At last, however, the party was made up. 6 fellows were to stay on board, and the remaining 13, including Silver, began to embark. Then it was that there came into my head the first of the mad notions that contributed to so much to save our lives. If 6 men were left by Silver, it was plain our party could not take and fight the ship, and since only 6 were left, it was equally plain that the cabin party had no present need of my assistance. It occurred to me at once to go ashore. In a jiffy I had slipped over the side and curled up in the fore sheets of the nearest boat, and almost at the same moment she shoved off. No one took notice of me, only the bow oar saying, "Is that you, Jim? Keep your head down." But Silver from the other boat looked sharply over and called out to know if that were me, and from that moment I began to regret what I had done. The crews raced for the beach, but the boat I was in, having some start, and being at once the lighter and the better manned, shot far ahead of her consort, and the bow had struck among the shoreside trees, and I had caught a branch and swung myself out and plunged into the nearest thicket, while Silver and the rest were still 100 yards behind. "Jim! Jim!" I heard him shouting. But you may suppose I paid no heed. Jumping, ducking, and breaking through, I ran straight before my nose till I could run no longer. Chapter 14. The First Blow. I was so pleased at having given the slip to Long John that I began to enjoy myself and look about me with some interest on the strange land that I was in. I had crossed a marshy tract full of willows, bulrushes, and odd, outlandish, swampy trees, and I had now come out upon the skirts of an open piece of undulating, sandy country about a mile long, dotted with a few pines and a great number of contorted trees, not unlike the oak in growth, but pale in the foliage like willows. On the far side of the open stood one of the hills, with 2 quaint, craggy peaks shining vividly in the sun. I now felt for the first time the joy of exploration. The isle was uninhabited. My shipmates I had left behind, and nothing lived in front of me but dumb brutes and fowls. I turned hither and thither through the trees. Here and there were flowering plants unknown to me. Here and there I saw snakes, and one raised his head from a ledge of rock and hissed at me with a noise not unlike the spinning of a top. Little did I suppose that he was a deadly enemy, and that the noise was the famous rattle. Then I came to a long thicket of these oak-like trees, live or evergreen oaks, I heard afterwards they should be called, which grew low along the sand, like brambles, the boughs curiously twisted, and foliage compact, like thatch. The thicket stretched down from the top of one of the sandy knolls, spreading and growing taller as it went, until it reached the margin of the broad, reedy fen, through which the nearest of the little rivers soaked its way into the anchorage. The marsh was steaming in the strong sun, and the outline of the spyglass trembled through the haze. All at once there began to go a sort of a bustle amongst the bulrushes. A wild duck flew up with a quack. Another followed, and soon over the whole surface of the marsh a great cloud of birds hung, screaming and circling in the air. I judged at once that some of my shipmates must be drawing near along the borders of the fen. Nor was I deceived, for soon I heard the very distant and low tones of a human voice, which, as I continued to give ear, grew steadily louder and nearer. This put me in a great fear, and I crawled under cover of the nearest live oak and squatted there, hearkening, as silent as a mouse. Another voice answered, and then the first voice, which I now recognized to be Silver's, once more took up the story, and ran on for a long while in a stream, only now and again interrupted by the other. By the sound they must have been talking earnestly and almost fiercely, but no distinct word came to my hearing. At last the speakers seemed to have paused, and perhaps to have sat down, for not only did they cease to draw any nearer, but the birds themselves began to grow more quiet, and to settle again in their places in the swamp. And now I began to feel that I was neglecting my business, that since I had been so foolhardy as to come ashore with these desperadoes, the least I could do was to overhear them at their councils, and that my plain and obvious duty was to draw as near as I could manage under the favorable ambush of the crouching trees. I could tell the direction of the speakers pretty exactly, not only by the sound of their voices, but by the behavior of the few birds that still hung in alarm around the heads of the intruders. Crawling on all fours, I made steadily but slowly towards them, until at last, raising my head to an aperture amongst the leaves, I could see clear down into a little green dell beside the marsh, and closely set about with trees, where Long John Silver and another of the crew stood, face to face in conversation. The sun beat full upon them. Silver had thrown his hat beside him on the ground, and his great, smooth, blond face, all shining with heat, was lifted to the other man's in a kind of appeal. "Mate," he was saying, "it's because I thinks gold dust of you. Gold dust! And you may lay to that. If I hadn't took to you like pitch, do you think that I'd have been here a-warning you? All's up. You can't make nor mend. It's to save your neck that I'm speaking. And it's one of the wild ones knew it, and that'd I be, Tom. Now tell me, where'd I be?" "Silver," said the other man, and I observed he was not only red in the face, but spoke as hoarse as a crow, and his voice shook, too, like a taut rope. "Silver," says he, "you're old, and you're honest, or has the name for it, and you've money, too, which lots of poor sailors hasn't, and you're brave, or I mistook. And will you tell me that you'll let yourself be led away with that kind of a mess of swabs? Not you. As sure as God sees me, I'd sooner lose my hand if I turn against my duty." And then all of a sudden he was interrupted by a noise. I had found one of the honest hands. Well, here, at the same moment, came news of another. Far away, out in the marsh, there arose, all of a sudden, a sound like the cry of anger, and then another on the back of it, and then one horrid, long-drawn-out scream. The rocks at the spyglass re-echoed it a score of times. The whole troop of marsh birds rose up again, darkening heaven with a simultaneous whir, and long after that death yell was still ringing in my brain. Silence had re-established its empire, and only the rustle of the redescending birds and the boom of the distant surges disturbed the languor of the afternoon. Tom had leaped at the sound, like a horse at the spur, but Silver had not winked an eye. He stood where he was, resting lightly on his crutch, watching his companion like a snake about to spring. John, said the sailor, stretching out his hand. Hands off, cried Silver, leaping back a yard, as it seemed to me, with the speed and security of a trained gymnast. Hands off, if you like, John Silver, said the other. It's a black conscience that can make you fear to me. But in heaven's name, tell me what was that? That, returned Silver, smiling away, but warier than ever, his eye on a mere pinpoint in his big face, but gleaming like a crumb of glass. That? Oh, I reckon that'll be Alan. And at this, poor Tom flashed out like a hero. Alan, he cried. Then rest his soul for a true seaman. And as for you, John Silver, long you've been a mate of mine, but you're a mate of mine no more. If I die it like a dog, I'll die in my duty. You've killed Alan, have you? Kill me too if you can, but I defies you. And with that, this brave fellow turned his back directly on the cook, and set off walking for the beach. But he was not destined to go far. With a cry, John seized the branch of a tree, whipped the crutch out of his armpit, and sent that uncouth missile hurtling through the air. It struck poor Tom point foremost, and with stunning violence right between the shoulders and the middle of his back. His hands flew up. He gave a sort of gasp, and fell. Whether he were injured, much or little, none could ever tell. Like enough, to judge from the sound. His back was broken on the spot, but he had no time given him to recover. Silver, agile as a monkey, even without leg or crutch, was on top of him next moment, and had twice buried his knife up to the hilt in that defenseless body. From my place of ambush I could hear him pant aloud as he struck the blows. I do not know what it rightly is to faint, but I do know that for the next little while the whole world swam away from before me in a whirling mist. Silver and the birds and the tall spyglass hilltop going round and topsy-turvy before my eyes, and all manner of bells ringing and distant voices shouting in my ear. When I came again to myself, the monster had pulled himself together, his crutch under his arm, his hat upon his head. Just before him, Tom lay motionless upon the sward, but the murderer minded him not a whit, cleansing his blood-stained knife the while upon a wisp of grass. Everything else was unchanged, the sun still shining mercilessly on the steaming marsh and the tall pinnacle of the mountain, and I could scarce persuade myself that murder had been actually done, and a human life cruelly cut short a moment since before my eyes. But now John put his hand into his pocket, brought out a whistle, and blew upon it several modulated blasts that rang far across the heated air. I could not tell, of course, the meaning of this signal, but it instantly awoke my fears. More men would be coming. I might be discovered. They had already slain 2 of the honest people. After Tom and Alan, might not I come next? Instantly I began to extricate myself and crawl back again, with that speed and silence I could manage, to the more open portion of the wood. As I did so, I could hear hails coming and going between the old buccaneer and his comrades, and this sound of danger lent me wings. As soon as I was clear of the thicket, I ran as I never run before, scarce minding the direction of my flight, so long as it led me from the murderers, and as I ran, fear grew and grew upon me until it turned into a kind of frenzy. Indeed, could anyone be more entirely lost than I? When the gun fired, how should I dare to go down to the boats amongst those fiends still smoking from their crime? Would not the first of them who saw me wring my neck like a snipe? Would not my absence itself be an evidence to them of my alarm, and therefore of my fatal knowledge? It was all over, I thought. Goodbye to the Hispaniola, goodbye to the squire, the doctor, and the captain. There was nothing left for me but death by starvation, or death by the hands of the mutineers. All this while, as I say, I was still running, and without taking any notice I had drawn near to the foot of the little hill with the 2 peaks, and had gone to a part of the island where the live oaks grew more widely apart, and seemed more like forest trees in their bearing and dimensions. Mingled with these were a few scattered pines, some 50, some near 70 feet high. The air, too, smelt more freshly than down beside the marsh, and here a fresh alarm brought me to a standstill with a thumping heart. Chapter 15. The Man of the Island. From the side of the hill, which was here steep and stony, a spout of gravel was dislodged, and fell rattling and bounding through the trees. My eyes turned instinctively in that direction, and I saw a figure leap with great rapidity behind the trunk of a pine. What it was, whether bear or man or monkey, I could in no wise tell. It seemed dark and shaggy, more I knew not. But the terror of this new apparition brought me to a stand. I was now, it seemed, cut off upon both sides, behind me the murderers, before me this lurking nondescript, and immediately I began to prefer the dangers that I knew to those I knew not. Silver himself appeared less terrible in contrast with this creature of the woods, and I turned on my heel, and looking sharply behind me over my shoulder, began to retrace my steps in the direction of the boats. Instantly the figure reappeared, and, making a wide circuit, began to head me off. I was tired, at any rate, but had I been as fresh as when I rose, I could see it was in vain for me to contend in speed with such an adversary, for from trunk to trunk the creature flitted like a deer, running manlike on two legs, but unlike any man I had ever seen, stooping almost double as it ran, and yet a man it was. I could no longer be in doubt about that. I began to recall what I had heard of cannibals. I was within an ace of calling for help, but the mere fact that he was a man, however wild, had somewhat reassured me, and my fear of Silver began to reprieve in proportion. I stood still, therefore, and cast about for some method of escape, and, as I was so thinking, the recollection of my pistol flashed into my mind. As soon as I remembered I was not defenseless, courage glowed again in my heart, and I set my face resolutely for this man of the island, and walked briskly towards him. He was concealed, by this time, behind another tree trunk, but he must have been watching me very closely, for as soon as I began to move in his direction, he reappeared, and took a step to meet me. Then he hesitated, drew back, came forward again, and at last, to my wonder and confusion, threw himself on his knees and held out his clasped hands in supplication. And at that I once more stopped. "Who are you?" I asked. "Oh, Ben Gunn," he answered, and his voice sounded hoarse and awkward like a rusty lock. "I'm poor Ben Gunn, I am, and I haven't spoke with a Christian these last 3 years. I could now see that he was a white man like myself, and that his features were even pleasing. His skin, wherever it was exposed, was burnt by the sun. Even his lips were black, and his fair eyes looked quite startling in so dark of a face. Of all the beggarmen that I had seen or fancied, he was the chief for raggedness. He was clothed with tatters of old ship's canvas and old sea-cloth, and this extraordinary patchwork was all held together by a system of the most various and incongruous fastenings, brass buttons, bits of stick, and loops of tarry gaskin. About his waist he wore an old brass-buckled leather belt, which was the one thing solid in his whole accoutrement. 3 years, I cried. "Were you shipwrecked?" "Nay, mate," says he, "marooned." I had heard the word, and I knew it stood for a horrible kind of punishment, common enough amongst the buccaneers, in which the offender is put ashore with a little powder and shot, and left behind on some desolate and distant island. "Marooned 3 years agone," he continued, "and lived on goats since then, and berries and oysters. Whether a man is, says I, a man can do for himself. But, mate, my heart is sore for Christian diet. You mightn't happen to have a piece of cheese about you now." "No, well, many's a long night I've dreamed of cheese, toasted mostly, and woke up again, and here I were." "If ever I can get aboard again," said I, "you shall have cheese by the stone." All this time he'd been feeling the stuff of my jacket, smoothing my hands, looking at my boots, and generally, in the intervals of his speech, showing a childish pleasure in the presence of a fellow creature. But at my last words he perked up into a kind of startled slyness. "If ever you can get aboard again, says you," he repeated. "Why, now who is to hinder you?" "Not you, I know," was my reply. "And right you was," he cried. "Now you, what do you call yourself, mate?" "Jim," I told him. "Jim, Jim," says he, quite pleased apparently. "Well now, Jim, I've lived that rough as so rough you'd be ashamed to hear of it. Now, for instance, you wouldn't think that I had a pious mother to look at me?" he asked. "Why, no, not in particular," I answered. "Ah, well," said he, "but I had, remarkable pious, and I was a civil, pious boy, and could rattle off my catechism that fast, so you couldn't tell one word from another. And here's where it come to, Jim, and it begun with Chuck Farthen on the blessed gravestones. That's what it begun with, but it went further than that, and so my mother told me, and predicted the whole she did, that pious woman. But it were Providence that put me here. I've thought it all out of this here lonely island, and I'm back on piety. You don't catch me tasting rum so much, and just a thimbleful for luck, of course. The first chance I have, I'm bound I'll be good, and I see the way too. And Jim," looking all around him and lowering his voice to a whisper, "I'm rich." I now felt sure the poor fellow had gone crazy in his solitude, and I suppose that I must have shown the feeling in my face, for he repeated the statement hotly. "Rich! Rich!" says I. "And I'll tell you what, I'll make a man of you, Jim. Oh, Jim, you bless your stars, you will. You was the very first that found me." And at this there came suddenly a lowering shadow over his face, and he tightened his grasp upon my hand and raised a forefinger threateningly before my eyes. "Now, Jim, you tell me true. That ain't Flint ship?" he asked. At this I had a happy inspiration. I began to believe that I'd found an ally when I answered him at once. "It's not Flint's ship, and Flint is dead, but I'll tell you true, as you ask me. There are some of Flint's hands aboard. Worse luck for the rest of us." "Not a man with one leg?" he gasped. "Silver?" I asked. "Ah, Silver," says he. "That were his name. He's the cook, and the ringleader too." He was still holding me by the wrist, and at that he gave it quite a wring. "If you were sent by Long John," he said, "I'm as good as pork, and I know it. But where was you, do you suppose?" I had made my mind up in a moment, and by way of answer told him the whole story of our voyage and the predicament in which we found ourselves. He heard me with the keenest interest, and when I had done he patted me on the head. "You're a good lad, Jim," he said, "and you're all in a clove hitch, ain't you? Well, you just put your trust in old Ben Gunn. Ben Gunn's the man to do it. Wouldn't you think it likely now that your squire would prove to be a liberal-minded one in case of any help, him being in a clove hitch, as you remark?" I told him the squire was the most liberal of men. "Aye, but you see," returned Ben Gunn, "I didn't mean giving me a gate to keep and a shut delivery close and such. That's not me mark, Jim. What I mean is, would he be likely to come down to the tomb, say, £1,000 out of money that's as good as a man's own already?" "I'm sure that he would," said I. As it was, all hands went to share. "And a passage home?" he added, with a look of great shrewdness. "Why," I cried, "the squire's a gentleman. And besides, if we got rid of the others, we should all want you to help work the vessel home." "Ah," said he, "so you would." And he seemed very much relieved. "Now I'll tell you what," he went on, "so much I'll tell you, and no more. I were in Flint's ship when he buried the treasure, he and six strong seamen. There was a shore night one the week, and us standing off and on in the old Walrus. One fine day, up went the signal, and here come Flint by himself in a boat, and his head done up in a blue scarf. The sun was getting up, and mortal white he looked about the cutwater. But there he was, you mind, and the 6 all dead, dead and buried. How he'd done it, not a man aboard us could make out. It was battle, murder, and sudden death. Leastways, him against 6. Billy Bones was the mate. Long John, he was quartermaster, and they asked him where the treasure was. Ah, says he, you can go ashore now if you like, and stay, he says. But as for this ship, she'll beat up for more, by thunder. And that's what he said. Well, I was in another ship 3 years back, and we sighted the island. Boys, said I, here's Flint's treasure. Let's land and let's find it. And the captain was displeased by that, but my messmates were all of a mind and landed. 12 days there they looked for it, and every day they had that worse they had the worse. They had the worst word for me, until one fine morning all hands went aboard. As for you, Benjamin Gunn, says they, here's a musket, they says, and a spade and pickaxe. You can stay right here and find Flint's money for yourself, they says. Well, Jim, 3 years have I been here, and not a bite of Christian diet from that day to this. By now, you look here, look at me. Do I look like a man before the mast? No, says you, nor I weren't neither, I says. And with that he winked and pinched my hand. Just you mention them words to your squire, Jim, he went on. Not he weren't neither, that's the words. 3 years he were the man of this island, light and dark and fair and rain, and sometimes he would, maybe, think upon a prayer, says you, and sometimes he would, maybe, think of his old mother, so that she be alive, you'll say. But the most part of Gunn's time, this is what you'll say, the most part of that time was took up by another matter, and then you'll give him a nip like I do. And he pinched me again in the most confidential manner. Then, he continued, then you'll up and you'll say this. Gunn is a good man, you'll say, and he puts a precious sight more confidence, a precious sight, mind that, in a gentleman born than in these here gentlemen of fortune, having been one himself. Well, I said, I don't understand one word that you have been saying, but that's neither here nor there, for how am I to get on board? Ah, said he, there's the hitch, for sure. Well, there's my boat, and I made with my 2 hands. I keep her under the White Rock. If the worst come to the worst, we might try that after dark. Hi, he broke out. What's that? For just then, although the sun had still an hour or 2 to run, all of the echoes of the island awoke and bellowed to the thunder of a cannon. They've begun to fight, I cried. Follow me. And I began to run towards the anchorage, my terrors all forgotten, while near at my side the marooned man in his goat skins trotted easily and lightly. Left, left, says he. Keep on your left hand, matey Jim. Under the trees now with you. There's where I killed me first goat. They don't come down here now. They were all mast-headed on them mornings for the fear of Benjamin Gunn. Ha ha! And there's the cemetery. And there's the cemetery, he must have meant. You see them mounds? I come here and prayed nows and thens when I thought that maybe a Sunday would be about due. It weren't quite a chapel, but it seemed more solemn-like, and then, says you, Ben Gunn was short-handed. No chaplain, not so much as a Bible and flag, you says. So we kept talking as I ran, neither expecting nor receiving any answer. The cannon shot was followed after a considerable interval by a volley of small arms. Another pause, and then, not a quarter of a mile in front of me, I beheld the Union Jack flutter in the air above a wood. And here is where we will call it for today. I hope everyone will join me next week for part 4, titled The Stockade, and chapter 16, titled Narrative Continued by the Doctor, How the Ship was Abandoned. Thanks, everybody. Bye.